Hello, and welcome back to Worm from Home. This time, we're taking a diversion from the usual tight focus on East London's environmental history and doing something of a creature feature. Today, the 21st of October, is International Earthworm Day, and this episode is all about the earthworm. A few people have asked me, given the name of the podcast, when are we going to get to the worms? While most of them were probably joking, I thought it might be fun to do a dedicated worm episode while I'm preparing material for some future series on more wide-ranging topics. A shorter, sweeter, and definitely wrigglier episode. I also recently gave a worm walk, a walking talk where we discussed earthworms, their biology and ecology, and their ecosystem functions at a nature reserve. This episode is a version of that talk, edited to give a more generalised overview of worms' ecological contributions to urban and rural ecologies. Worm is not a taxonomically precise term. Historically, a worm is not only the earthworm, but a maggot, a snake, and even a dragon, sometimes written as wyrm. The semantic scope of worm appears to be a tube-shaped creature, either lacking or with very small legs. I think that worms get short shrift. In English, they are lowly. We think of them as unseeing dwellers in dirt. Worm is often the colloquial word for any number of invertebrates that we find wriggly and revolting. The juvenile grub form of flies, maggots that we associate with putrefaction and death. Many nematodes are parasitic and dangerous to human health. Our aversion to worms is not irrational. We reasonably want to avoid sources of disease. We are averse to sites of death and decomposition. But every worm is just a worm, with its own position in its ecosystem, its own contributions to its surrounding ecology. Many, including and especially the focus of today's episode, the earthworm, are not only vital contributors to vast ecosystems, but in particular for the needs of human beings living within and relying on those ecosystems. But I think it would be a shame to think of earthworms only in terms of their tangible benefits to humanity. Invertebrates are often thought of as uncharismatic, and so less likely to draw the dedicated conservation energy focused on the larger vertebrates like mammals and birds. I think we could ask ourselves, how much charisma is in the eye of the beholder, or rather, how much charisma is a matter of noticing, of paying attention to behaviours and features of an animal, and creating a relationship to it that is based in wonder. Invertebrates are so unlike us, but need and do so many of the same things in food, nesting, and reproduction. There is an uncanny strangeness here, but also a familiarity, one that I think can be the basis for both sympathy and fascination. I would like us to become re-enchanted with the worm. In current taxonomic parlance, worms are considered to fall into three main groups: the flatworms, the nematodes, and the annelids. It is the group annelid that we find earthworms in a phylum subclass called Oligoceta. There are several types of earthworm, about 30 in Britain alone, differing in size, colour, and some elements of their behaviour, but they also have many distinct similarities. Earthworms are endemic and native to Britain, present here in most landscapes that have soil. They have lived here since the end of the last ice age, when, as with the trees that we discussed in episode 1, worms made their way here across the Doggle and Land Bridge as temperatures rose and soils defrosted. All earthworms in Britain that have not been imported will be descendants of those worms who made the trek northwards as the ice withdrew. The basic body plan of an earthworm is a muscular tube around a digestive system that runs throughout the body. This simple shape hides, to our perception, remarkable complexity, a challenge to our species' chauvinism perhaps, to find that the lowly worm is so full of complicated mechanisms for being a worm. Earthworms have segmented bodies, ridges that are visible to the naked eye, and indeed the taxonomic term annelid is derived from the Latin for these little rings. Each of these ridges, save for the first around the mouth, have a small number of bristles on them, and these are crucial for the worm's locomotion, allowing it to anchor a segment to the soil while contracting the body elsewhere to move forwards and backwards. Like us, but unlike many other invertebrates, earthworms have hemoglobin in their blood and so bleed red. Their circulatory system consists of blood and its vessels, but they have no one dedicated heart organ, but rather a set of thickenings of blood vessels that serve a similar pumping purpose. These occur opposite one another in pairs, and in Britain 5 pairs per worm are common, although there can be more. These thickened blood vessels, as well as many other of the worm's organs, are near the top of the worm's body, closer to the mouth. The mouth itself sits in the first segment, the only segment on the earthworm's body that has no bristles. Around the esophageal opening is a muscular lobe called the pharynx. This can both withdraw into the body and so seal off the esophagus, thereby closing the worm's mouth, or be extended outwards to explore the worm's immediate environment. This segment is also where the worm keeps its brain, about the size of a pinhead. It's a common assumption that as well as being unseeing, worms are also unsensing and unfeeling. But this isn't the case, and this tiny brain is part of a central nervous system distributed throughout the worm's body. While worms do not see in the way that animals with eyes do, they are photosensitive, with many species having a strip of photosensitive cells along their upper back portion with which they can detect light. How this manifests to the worm's cognition, we can of course not know, but it is likely that it forms part of the worm's ability to tell whether or not it is above ground. The muscular pharynx lobe also has taste receptors, which allows the worm to collect information about its environment and in particular to find, from the worm's perspective, desirable food. Earthworms are also touch sensitive over their entire bodies, just like we are, and so presumably feel the soil all around them as they tunnel through the earth. Worms have no lungs, but conduct gas exchange through their skin. Their digestive system, however, is a bit more familiar to us. From the mouth and esophagus, this digestive system leads on to a crop and a gizzard, much like that seen in birds. While moving through the esophagus, food is mixed with calcium carbonate that the worm secretes as a waste product. The crop then holds the food until it is ready to pass further into the digestive system, and the gizzard grinds it into more digestible consistencies by muscle contractions around small stones that the worm eats for this purpose. This, as in many animals without teeth, serves the same purpose as chewing does in animals that do. Worms have no stomach, however, and after the food in the crop has been fully ground up, it continues into the worm's long digestive system where nutrients are absorbed through the blood-rich lining of the intestine. When the worm's feces emerges, this is called worm cast. These casts have extremely important ecological functions in maintaining soil quality, and we're going to talk more about those in just a moment. Before we get to the impact of earthworms on their environments, we should talk about worm reproduction. Earthworms have no sexual dimorphism. There are no males or females, only worms, each of which produces two types of gametes, sperm and ova. Sperm is stored in seminal vesicles that sit above the crop, and eggs in two ovaries. Many types of earthworm are thus capable of parthenogenic reproduction. However, even worms that can reproduce without a mate will usually choose one if it is available. Parthenogenesis is often unsustainable for any species that is capable of it, as it doesn't mix genes within the population, and so is often seen during times of low mate availability or other environmental pressures. I'm curious about how worms experience this drive to mate with others, whilst being mechanically capable of mating with themselves. No animal, not even human beings, truly reasons its way towards its sexual and reproductive urges. Earthworm mating is drawn out and intimate, and I do wonder whether they long for the touch of another worm. During mating, two worms will arrange their bodies top to tail. They move their bodies together, not losing contact, and twist over each other and tie together in knots. Sometimes several pairs of worms will mate together, all in one writhing pile, although why they do this is unclear. This proximity and motion creates a full-body reaction in the worms, who both begin to produce a slimy substance to cover one another in, a sexual fluid that creates optimal conditions for gamete exchange. During this copulation, each worm releases sperm through sperm pores onto the body of the other worm. Each worm then takes their mate's sperm into its own body, into subcutaneous sacs called spermatoceae. They also release their eggs onto their own bodies through dedicated egg pores. As the worms mate, the one broad saddle band you can see on any earthworm, technically called the clitellum, begins to form a tube of slime around it that then fills with an albuminous liquid. This fluid-filled ring is where worm conception will take place. The slime ring stiffens in the fresh air until it is ready to detach from the clitellum band, and the worm begins to move it down its body, effectively crawling through the slime tube it has created. As the worm moves, this tube picks up the worm's own ova that it has released onto its skin and the other worm's sperm that is secreted from the sperm storage sacs where it has been kept temporarily. During this process, some of the worm's own sperm may also be pulled into the tube, and so it is not unusual for one worm to be both mother and father of some proportion of its own eggs. The worm continues to crawl through the tube, dragging it down its body until it gets to the tip of the tail and falls off. Now on the ground and significantly hardened in consistency, the open ends of the tube close up and form a type of cocoon. Within this cocoon, the conception of worms takes place and is where the yellowish, corn kernel-shaped eggs will develop until hatching. Baby worms start out small and white, and as they grow, they take on their adult colours, pinks, browns, or yellows, until they eventually reach sexual maturity and adulthood, with the development of the saddle at about 2 or 3 months old. Lifespans vary depending on environmental conditions and risks, but a typical earthworm can live for 2 to 7 years. During this life, the worm looks for food, eats and excretes, reproduces, builds nests. Basically, all of this worm activity takes place on or around the soil, and so the worm's direct ecological relationships are in large part with that soil, and it is there that a large proportion of its ecosystem effects are to be found. As earthworms move through the soil, they make alterations to its structure. In the 20th and 21st centuries, scientists have investigated and debated whether the ways that worms move through the soil can be a useful way to categorize subtypes of earthworm. Earlier iterations of this theory held that the features of worms, like their colour and size, could be mapped effectively to their burrowing behaviour. In this view, anisic earthworms with a deep burrowing, coming to the surface to find food and excrete, and otherwise living below the ground in vertical tunnel burrows. The anisic worms were thought to be the largest species in Britain, with dark red and brown colouring. The paler worms, pinkish, greyish, and even blue-green, were categorised as endogeic, also tunnelling, but generally creating shallower horizontal burrows for feeding and nesting. Finally, the red and sometimes stripy surface-dwelling epigeic worms live in leaf litter on the surface of the soil, rarely ever burrowing. Later research found this form-to-function mapping insufficient, noting that worm features and worm behaviour were not so tightly coupled as previously thought. Ecologists began instead to consider different soil depth burrowing as a way to classify worm types into functional groups, where the notable classification element was not the appearance at all, but actions within the ecosystem. 6 new categories were proposed. First, the litter dwellers, surface-dwelling worms who nonetheless make some shallow galleries for food or egg storage underground. Then, the shallow or deep biotubators, who have much lower observed activity on the surface, making extensive galleries in the soil. While often larger and paler, it is the amount of tunnelling such worms do that places them into these groups rather than any feature of their anatomy or appearance. These are joined by the burrowers, who feed and cast on the surface, but also make a small number of true burrows in the soil. These tunnels are horizontal and connect to one another in a shallow system used by the worm in its frequent forays onto the surface. The intense tunnellers combine several of these burrowing behaviours, and when not at the surface, make large burrow systems interspersed by deeper vertical tunnels. A 6th all-players category, intermediate, was also added, emphasising that even as earthworm behaviour may systematically differ, worm interactions with the soil are not always entirely predictable. Today, this has evolved into a slightly looser schema, a 3-pointed spectrum between epigeic, endogeic, and anisic worm behaviours on which different earthworm tunnelling habits fall. No doubt our theories and schematisation of earthworm behaviour will continue to develop, reflecting a more accurate picture of how worms live and what it is that we as observers find most salient about their ecological functions at the time. However we choose to describe them, these differing worm lifestyles all make changes to soil structure. As worms move through the soil, they churn it up and mix its components together, evening out the distribution of nutrients present and ensuring that newly decomposed matter is mixed with existing soil. Both the deep vertical tunnels and shallower horizontal burrow systems also create soil pores of different shapes and sizes. These tunnels that worms create become channels for water. They allow for deeper percolation of water into the soil, especially where deep tunneling worms make large vertical soil pores that allow water to flow into levels of the soil that rainfall might not otherwise reach. This, as well as movement through shallower burrow systems, is crucial for maintaining the water table and the soil fertility that comes from adequate moisture. Where fewer worms are present, the lack of these passageways for water ingress often render soils much more vulnerable to erosion and the leaching out of nutrients. These physical effects of worm activity also have secondary chemical effects. As well as distributing nutrients through the soil, worm motion also redistributes soil-dwelling bacteria and other microorganisms. Many of these are beneficial to the health of that soil, including a class of microorganisms sometimes called bioremediators. These break down toxic chemicals, considered soil pollutants, into components that are not toxic to animals and plants, and in doing so, clean the soil of these contaminants. In an urban ecological context, such microorganic activity is extremely helpful to the maintenance or improvement of soils affected by environmental or historical pollutants. When they're not tunneling, all worms cast on the surface, which is just a polite way to say that they leave piles of their feces on the ground, sometimes in the form of middens near the entryways to their burrows, and sometimes wherever they happen to be on the surface. You've probably seen these, even if you were unsure of what they were. Soft piles of clearly visible tubular curls between tufts of grass in a playing field or park, or perhaps in a flower bed. These casts also have a soil engineering function. Part of what worms eat is soil itself, and when they excrete, the waste soil matter has had mucus-like substances added to it through the digestive process. This mucus is important in the formation of soil aggregate, which gardeners might recognise as an important soil type, made up of soil particles that stick together easily, creating a softer substance that is much less vulnerable to erosion. Casting is an illogical effect both of worm behaviours above ground and also of their dietary habits. Worms eat a varied diet: fallen leaves and other vegetable litter found on the ground, fungi, bacteria found in the soil, and sometimes even meat in the form of dead animal matter. When earthworms are described as vital to processes of decomposition, this is the mechanism by which much of this decomposition occurs. Worms eat dead matter, and when they excrete the component parts of this organic matter that their bodies have not absorbed, it has been decomposed into its constituent parts. This is important in a general sense. Worms, along with other ecological actors like bacteria and fungi, return chemical components to the soil where they can be reused by other animals and plants, vital participants in a cycle that makes life on Earth sustainable and that ensures that life continues to follow on from death. The specifics of this process, too, are crucial for the health of other living things that rely on the soil. The presence of organic matter makes soil fertile due to specific chemicals in that matter. In worm casts, for example, the levels of phosphorus are up to 7 times as high as the surrounding soil, and nitrogen 5 times as high. Worms eating and excreting also massively increases the concentration of bacteria in soil, many strains of which are crucial for that soil's fertility. But as worms go about their lives, they often become food themselves for other animals, including many urban animals. Having made an effort to re-enchant you with worms, I'm sorry to say that we also need to talk about the important ecological role they have when they are killed and eaten by other animals. Mammals, birds, and even other invertebrates all feed on earthworms, and they make a very good food source. As well as containing many essential amino acids, the worm's muscular flesh is also very high in protein. Studies have shown that this flesh comprises between 1.5 and 17.3% fat, making it highly nutritious. Many insects will feed on this worm flesh, including ants, spiders, and even other soft-bodied invertebrates like slugs and snails. Many of these will feed on the worm as carrion, but some beetles have been observed actually hunting and killing earthworms as prey. Larger animals also hunt for worms, including field and hedgerow-dwelling small mammals like moles and hedgehogs. But even quite large mammals will make a meal of an earthworm's nutritious flesh too, and worms can be eaten by badgers and widespread urban animals like foxes. Lastly, whether or not it is in fact the case that the early bird gets the worm, earthworms do form a significant component of the diet of many birds. For those of us in cities, many of our most familiar birds feed on earthworms: thrushes, gulls, crows, robins, and blackbirds, to name but a few. Blackbirds eat a lot of worms, listening for them as they move through the surface leaf litter, or spotting their heads when they poke them up from their underground burrows. Other birds, like some species of owl, are even more efficient worm spotters, being able to hear the worms actually crawling through their tunnels within the soil and lying in wait until the worm appears above the ground when they can strike. Worms can form a part of certain robin courtship rituals. If you're lucky, come springtime, you might see two robins hopping about together, one pulling an earthworm out of the ground and presenting it to a prospective mate who, if they like it, will accept the worm and then eat it. With worms being so important to birds, it's perhaps not surprising that it's the British Ornithological Trust that last year released the first long-term analysis of earthworm numbers in Britain. The picture it painted was surprisingly bleak. Over the last 25 years, British ecosystems may have lost up to a third of their earthworms. As no long-term dedicated monitoring project of earthworms exists in Britain, these results were produced by synthesizing data from a century of smaller, more local earthworm population studies, as well as a small number of newly commissioned studies specifically for this project. In one of these, school children in different areas counted both earthworms and blackbirds in their playgrounds and on their playing fields. The results were remarkably consistent. Where there were fewer earthworms, fewer blackbirds also followed. We all know that many species, both worldwide and in Britain, are declining, and that this is to a significant degree due to direct and indirect impacts of human activity. But what precisely is it that has so negatively impacted the British earthworm over the last 25 years? One answer may lie in soil moisture. As mentioned earlier in the episode, worms have no lungs but still require gases for respiration, which they absorb and exchange through their skin. This process requires moisture both in the worm's skin and in the surrounding soil. As global climate change creates hotter summers in Britain, soils are often drier, depriving earthworms of the ideal conditions for life. This is supported by a 2019 review by Jaswinder Singh and colleagues that found that while worm activity may rise along with temperatures, this is only the case where soil moisture also remains high, but drought is associated with a decline in both worm activity and worm numbers. Other effects may be more local. The British Ornithological Society meta-study found that negative impacts on earthworm numbers were most severe in farmland and woodlands. The latter might strike us as more surprising than the first, but, as we've discussed previously, woodlands are environments that experience a large amount of human interaction and intervention, much as farms do. Human involvement with landscape does appear to be correlated with significant decrease in worm numbers, and much of this is hypothesized by the study's authors to be down to the use of pesticides and inorganic fertilizers that alter the chemical composition of soils to the disadvantage of the worms. This effect would then be seen both in arable land itself and also in surrounding areas if these pollutants begin to spread through the soil. As the study was a synthesis of existing data rather than an experiment in and of itself, it remains to be seen which precise fertilizers may be having the biggest impact on worm populations at the moment. This decline, estimated to be at a rate of about 2% a year, is of course devastating for the worm itself. But it is also destructive for everything in the worm's environment, plants and other animals, including human beings, who rely on fertile arable land for maintaining our food system and food security. The effect of earthworm loss on soils can be severe, with disastrous effects on both wild plants and on agriculture. Without sufficient worm numbers, all the beneficial physical and chemical soil engineering effects that have been outlined in this episode cease to happen, or at least decline significantly in their scope and effect. This leads to soils that are less fertile, drier, and less aerated with required gases. Without earthworms, a crucial ecological plank in soil biomass creation, that is, the process by which new organic matter is synthesized to create more soil, is gone. In addition, lower numbers of worms also mean less available food for animals who count earthworms as part of their diet. Alongside the worm-loving blackbirds, many other invertebrate-eating bird numbers like thrushes and terns are declining in Britain, and the disappearance of such a nutritious food source as earthworms may be a factor in these falling species numbers. Protecting the earthworm seems to be an obvious and urgent need, both for the worm, its predators, and for ourselves, one of the recipients of its extraordinary soil improvement abilities. Even if I've not managed to convince you that earthworms themselves are beautiful and interesting creatures, some of your favourite mammals or birds may rely on them to feed. And if even that doesn't move you, you do still need to eat, and over 90% of global agriculture relies on soil, and soil that needs to be fertile and of good quality. On a micro level, keeping private and community gardens, allotments, and nature reserves that you might care for well watered during hot, dry spells will likely be helpful to the worms living there. But as with so much deleterious ecological change, the answers do not really lie at the level of personal action. Protecting the worm must be a collective effort, in part because the threats to worms, global warming and industrial farming practices, exist at scale, far beyond the level at which we can be effective as individual actors. Earthworm protection is an ecological question, of course, but also undoubtedly a political one. To protect the earthworm, we must continue to do what we can to prevent global average temperatures from rising higher and to pressure for the creation of farming policies that are more sustainable. I want you to love the earthworm for its own characteristics and for the vital functions it provides. To love the worm might mean going on a climate march, lobbying your MP, or pushing for more ecologically sound practices within your workplace. And it might mean reminding people you meet of the crucial place that earthworms have in the ecosystem, how much we rely on them, and how much their future now relies on us. Many sources for this episode came from materials made available by the Earthworm Society of Britain. Do check out their resources online, and you can also become a member of the Society by visiting earthwormsoc.org.uk/join. Thank you so much for listening to this special episode of Worm from Home. If you've enjoyed the show and want to support production, you can do so with words by leaving a rating and review on your podcast app, sharing the episode, or telling your friends and family. Or, if you'd like, you can support the show with money by becoming a paid member at patreon.com/wormfromhome. In either case, your support will be really appreciated. I make this show because I love radio and I love nature, but also to create opportunities for myself and others to learn. If you have any questions, feedback, or knowledge you'd like to share, or analyses of your own on the topics we cover, please do get in touch on the Patreon, at Worm From Home on Twitter, or Worm From Home Pod on Instagram. Until next time.